We're at the 2014 Venice Biennale in the wine suite of the Hotel Danieli, and we're talking to Bernard Tschumi. Bernard, what was it that got you interested in architecture? And I suppose to some extent it must have been the fact that your father was a world-famous architect himself.
Well, maybe that's what at first got me not interested in architecture, as I felt I knew everything before I even began. And so I was, at the time, as a teenager, I was certainly more interested in literature, in film, in philosophy, in other things, and probably would have gone this way if I hadn't had the opportunity to spend some months in the US at age 17, and in a different cultural context, and visiting Chicago, I suddenly discovered what a city could be. Coming from a smallish Swiss town, I knew Paris, sure, because my mother was from there, but visiting a great American city just changed my view of the world. And it is in Chicago that I decided to become an architect. It was the weight, the sheer gravity, the strength, the density. Chicago was very different then. We're talking about the 1961-62. Before the Loop and that whole area had been developed, interestingly enough, you didn't have the perception of individual objects. You had the feeling of a mass which was uniformly 12 stories high. In between sort of shafts had been carved to let some light pass. And of course you had the elevated subway. It looked like one huge block of rock in which one had carved some opening. Now Chicago is something else. It's a series of individual towers. The Miesian model, I love Mies, but the Miesian model has not been so good for Chicago.
And how did you find your architectural education? Was it interested in cities in the way that you were interested, or was it a kind of more traditional model?
I went probably to one of the best traditional schools, in other words, the ETH in Zurich. They were not terribly interested in cities, except I had a very good urban history professor, Paul Hofer, and yes, I was interested, but within a context which was really of Swiss architecture, very much as we knew it at the time, and that we still know it today. And I obviously went through the motions, did reasonably well, but by the end of my 4.5 years was already looking quite distinctly elsewhere.
And where was the elsewhere? What happened next?
I had met Cedric Price, and I wanted to work for him. And well, let me tell you the story. I wanted him to be invited to give a lecture at the school, and as a student representative, normally I would have had my way, but I was told by my distinguished professors that Cedric was not architecture, and therefore we should not invite him. Which made him even more interesting for me, and that's then another long story.
And at what point did you start to make designs for competitions and to make buildings?
I was in Paris doing what they call, my practice year, sort of being an intern in an office. And I spent that time, as it happens, by chance, in Paris at Candeli's Joseph and Woods. And that made us what I would describe as a very critical generation. In other words, quite wary of the strange relationship of architecture with power, money, and a whole lot of received ideas. A lot of the modern movement had lost its originality and its rubbing, power. It was formulas. So during a few years, and that's probably what brought me to England, I decided to rather spend my time asking questions about what architecture was. So that was first my interest for Cedric. But also I ended up teaching at the A, and in a context which was encouraging people to ask questions. Tutors would not give programs. They would ask the students to invent a program. This is actually difficult. So that set up a situation which really requested not looking not only at architecture, but at things which were happening in the margins. In other words, the art scene, the literary scene, etc., etc. I was quite close to people in London at St. Martin's or at the Royal College of Art. And there was quite an interesting exchange, to such an extent that it made me feel I had to go even further into it. My interest for cities that had gone from Paris to London now was moving towards New York. There was an incredibly exciting and intense art scene in New York. And there I started to draw again. I had stopped drawing for 5 or 6 years after '68. But this time the drawings were substantially more experimental. They had a relatively little with actual designing building, but a lot to do with the city, namely trying to find a way to develop a mode of expression, I used to call it notation, that would show not only plan sections and elevations, but also the movements of bodies in space. And this led to what was called the Manhattan Transcripts. It was exhibited in art galleries and all this sort of thing. And so it's only another 6 years later, in other words, literally 12 years after I had graduated, that I said, well, now, so far so good, let's see if I can use some of these thoughts, ideas, or experiments into a real project. And that's the first time with the Parc de la Villette that I did a competition.
And this competition win was sensational, because here was an entirely different sort of proposition about the city, about a park, and a way of architectural thinking. Were you shocked when you won, or did you assume that actually that's what Paris would respect?
I'm tempting to tell you both. The real truth, I was really, I did not expect it at all. However, the first note that I wrote, I used sort of 8.5 by 11 inches, A4 paper, and there was a little note that was pinned up, and it said, do we do this competition for history or just because we want to win it? I had to, in a way, to learn everything, because frankly, I didn't know very much. And it was probably my ignorance, my innocence, which helped me lifting political mountains and other, economic and functional difficulties, because in many ways the project was unusual, also in the manner one organizes a site, one organizes users and so on. And I was extraordinarily lucky, it worked.
And actually there was an intriguing moment where it looked as though Cedric Price might actually do some sort of pavilion at La Villette. It was designed with Frank Newby as engineer.
Absolutely.
Quite a substantial job, but I got the impression that that the budgets were starting to be trimmed, and it was never realised.
This is exactly what happened. I had asked him, being not only the architect but the chief architect of the whole operation, I had asked a few people, including Cedric, to design something, and in the case of Cedric, it was quite a substantial greenhouse. And he had worked quite seriously on it, but it had to be financed not only by state public money, but also by private money, and the private money never came. It was never done, but you might be amused to know that I just completed, you probably know, I just completed the new Paris Zoo, and the greenhouse that I built there is a sort of silent homage to that very design by Cedric.
Can I ask you about your idea about notation and architecture, and the extent to which that impulse almost to combine formal architectural description with something more to do with choreography perhaps than architecture. Has that line of thinking in your work been consistent, or has it adjusted and changed?
I would say it's amusing because of the exhibition that we just opened just very recently at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, which covers a period that starts with the notation project, the drawings of movement of bodies in space, and ends with the current work. It's interesting to see how coherent the work is and how many devices that were invented at the time are being now, applied. The difference is that the way they were applied in the early work, in the drawings, was very literal. You'd see arrows drawn on a piece of paper. Now I don't have to do it, it's in my head. I just can immediately sort of materialize it in terms of a set of plans that are part of a concept that includes such notation.
And is it possible to apply that technique, if one could call it that, in thinking about master planning large areas of a city rather than a single building or even a single complex project, but thinking about the city as a whole?
Not only do I think, of course you can, considering that a lot of the workings of a city have to do with exchange and movement, but also the fact that it brings a certain level of uncertainty. In a house you might determine everything. In a city you cannot and you should not. So the way I see it, when we do urban project or urban design projects, I see it very much as a game. Imagine a form of chess game or Monopoly or whatever, where the various pieces can be moved around, and all the architect does is to establish the game board, a few pieces, a few rules, and then let the user or whoever start to play and develop it as a dynamic process and not as a frozen image.
It's a kind of theory of endless interaction, or interactions to interreactions.
I would say so, yeah.
And how do you see the condition of the contemporary city, first in the West and then perhaps in the emerging cities of Asia and the Far East? Do you draw comfort from the architectural thinking that's going into them?
Here my answer is not going to be very, very happy and not very optimistic. I do think that architects in the last 15 years, in the last 20 years, at a time of maximum urbanization in the whole history of mankind, have completely failed in their missions to design the city of today or tomorrow. And this is, I think we are all responsible. I probably am as much as my whole generation. Something has happened that instead of giving the proper guidelines, and among those hundreds of cities that are being built, hardly any of them is done with some sort of an objective sense of experimentation, of testing certain hypotheses and seeing how they can be demonstrated. At the moment, they are mostly all alike, especially when we talk about countries like the Middle East, or especially, of course, China. And there is a very, very serious problem. We are learning very little from what is being built at the moment. I could also extend your question to the cities in, in the, call it historical West, London, Paris, Munich, and so on, where somehow an incredible timidity has replaced the extraordinary thought and thinking processes that were taking place throughout the 20th century. In the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, we have seen quite, including the 70s, and I may totally disagree with Leon Creer and his proposal. At least there was a thinking going on. So somehow I hope that we can call it a period of transition, that historically I know when the work is too banal, or when the work is very much the so-called dictionary of received ideas, then irritation sets in, and critique and possibly theory comes back. So this is my hope as far as the city of tomorrow.
There's an interesting way in which your father, as a founder of the International Union of Architects, the UIA,
yes,
was engaged in it, as it were, the moral and ethical challenges that faced the profession, and by definition it was internationalist in outlook. And I wonder whether you think that attitude somehow has sort of transmuted into something which is sort of super internationalist, globalized, yet somehow the interests of architects have become much more individual and much less concerned, for the most part, with the common good, or with the generality about what is happening to everybody, as opposed to what is happening for their individual clients.
If we try to look back at what was happening in the late 40s, when architects got together and decided to put together a sort of international dialogue, it is clearly due to the fact that Europe and the world had been hurt tremendously by 2 world wars. And the intent, as far as I'm aware of it, was really to re-establish a dialogue among architects that would go above and beyond those nationalistic differences and political differences. So that was the starting point. Now, the evolution to the situation today is, of course, that save for manifestation or events like the Olympics, which are, highly nationalistic, everything has become quite global, and architects do travel everywhere. They have plenty of opportunity, including at such a place like this Venice Biennale where we are at the moment, where a dialogue is possible. But is there such a dialogue is the question. In other words, are we really setting up some questions, some goals, some hypotheses, or are we simply sort of bathing into a you know, a bath of self-indulgence and an icon for the general mass consumption.
You have practices in New York and Paris. My impression is that most of the significant projects you do tend to be either for public clients or institutional clients rather than you know, individual commercial property developers. Is that from choice, or is it just the way the practice has developed?
Probably both. Probably both. On one hand, it's the history of my activity comes with a large public project, as you know, with the Parc de la Villette. Therefore, I have been quite attracted to enter a number of competitions. We do reasonably well. We win probably 1 out of 4. They are public competitions. I'm able to choose these. So that's probably the primary reason, and it gives quite the possibility of a range, an international range of possibilities. We have, in between, some private clients will come to us, and we do certain projects. Currently, I'm completing 2 buildings near Geneva, one for the second watch factory after the first one I had done a few years back, and for a large concert hall for a private educational institution, but a very serious philharmonic hall for 1,000 seats, and both are private. So the two, and in New York, when we did the Blue Tower, that was also private people who generally would approach us, I have to say, almost out of the blue. But nevertheless, as you said correctly, the majority of the project, you know, the various concert halls or the New Acropolis Museum and so on, do come from public competitions.
The other aspect of your life as an architect, which is also public or quasi-public, is as a teacher. What do you see in today's architecture students at Columbia that reminds you of when you were a student, or are they quite different?
You know, I think architecture is something quite extraordinary because it's still in the making. There's in no way the feeling that it's not still in front of us. And so the places like schools are quite extraordinary because they are really the places that prepare the brew of what architecture will become tomorrow. The young faculty generally that has more energy and invention than actual work are fantastic people to work with, and indeed to develop what will become, you know, by necessity, the architecture and the cities of the next generation.
And do you find that there's an interest, which obviously you would share, with cities of the future, or is there more interest in, as it were, the kind of individual concerns and psychological considerations to do with space and time?
Well, amusingly enough, I would say, but that's an immediate answer. I mean, an answer which has to do with literally the last few years looking around what is happening around me. I would say there are two extremes. Very few actual buildings to be designed, and you know, the buildings that are published in the magazines are not necessarily what seem to interest the people in the school. What interests them is at the two ends of the spectrum, either the very small or the very large. The very small could be described as fabrication. How does one uses a number of extraordinary softwares to build up components and even to build, you know, apps for this that will allow, you know, new way to perceive space. On the other hand, the discussion about cities is indeed coming back. I don't know where it's going at this stage, but it is there. There is really an awareness, probably because of the fact that people travel a lot. Will do things, I take Colombia, they will do projects, you know, in Doha or in Istanbul or in outside Tokyo or and so on. And they will think quite seriously about that very problem that I mentioned, you know, a few minutes ago, about the fact that we are unfortunately in a rather, you know, not terribly creative period about city thinking.
Do you think that, in a sense, the collapse of space and time, because communication and travel are so much faster, if indeed they're necessary at all in the case of travel, that architects actually have yet to find a way of working in a digital world which isn't a kind of echo of working in an analog way, if you like. I mean, I ask this because I've been thinking about your point about notation, and in a way, what you were doing with that La Villette proposition, I mean, does have to do with how do you represent a world in which space and time can vanish or be kaleidoscope or be expanded, and actually, it's not so far off what we are now experiencing in a kind of digital environment.
I'm going to amuse you. Before that time when I came to London and then to New York, I did with a friend of mine a project called Do It Yourself City. It's a project which is heavily influenced by Cedric and by his second fun palace, the one that traveled around. And where the role of the internet had not been invented yet, but the role of mass communication and ability for people to simultaneously live in real space but communicate through media was the starting point, or even the whole organization of something that could be integrated into the existing city or the new towns or whatever. So that awareness was there. I think it is still possible, and it will inevitably come. So architects are always a little slow. Sometimes they're faster than others. Sometimes they take a while, right? But I think your question is absolutely correct. There's a moment when the two will interact. In other words, the software and the hardware, or in a way the invisible media, including the social media, and the architectural, hard stuff.
A final question: if you were giving advice, and you may well give advice to young architects who are about to start practice or try to start practice, what advice would you give them based on your own experience of competitions, buildings, exhibitions?
Never take anything for granted. Never accept what people tell you the solution is. Always start with a question.
Bernard Tschumi, thank you very much.